Hello, my name is Mark Scurrell. I'm the lead program manager for SQL Azure Data Sync. In this webcast, I want to provide you with an overview of the Data Sync service, including showing you how you can use SQL Azure Data Sync to sync your SQL Server 2012 databases with SQL Azure, thereby allowing both your on-premises and cloud-based applications to utilize the same data. So I'd like to start by running through the scenarios where that capability of synchronizing between on-premises and the cloud are required. So the first set of scenarios really revolve around the case where there are applications both running on-premises using SQL Server 2012 or in the cloud utilizing SQL Azure. So you have applications running on-premises, applications in the cloud, but they need to operate on the same data set or part of the same data set. So for example, there might be data being updated by the on-premises local applications updating in SQL Server, and that data is required by the cloud-based application. So you could use Data Sync to sync one way from on-premises up to the cloud. In other cases, it's the cloud-based application that's creating the data, that's updating the data, and that data is required by the on-premises applications. So in this case, you need that one-way synchronization from the cloud down to on-premises. And then there's the combination of both those cases, where you have both the cloud-based application and the on-premises application both updating their data sets, and therefore full two-way synchronization is required. There's another set of scenarios where you have multiple on-premises locations. So in one case, you could have your multiple locations. They could be branch offices, retail stores, restaurants, and so on. Each of those locations are running local applications, updating data, but again, those multiple locations need to operate over the same data set or a subset of that data set. So here the cloud, and SQL Azure in particular, can be used as a hub, really used as a hub or a conduit through which that sharing can happen and the data kept in sync and shared between the multiple locations. It's also the case if you have multiple local applications running, collecting data, updating data, and so on, where you want to consolidate that data, bring it together and have a global view across the multiple locations, across the multiple data sets in one place. So here the cloud and SQL Azure can be used as that place to consolidate the data, use on-premises, synchronize the data with the cloud, bring it all together, and then applications in the cloud, you get a global view across that data and across that consolidated data. You then make changes to that data in the cloud and then have the ability to push those changes down to each of the on-premises locations. So let's first of all take a look at how we can use SQL Azure Data Sync to synchronize between on-premises and the cloud. I'm going to start off by using SQL Server Management Studio to look at the databases, my on-premises and cloud-based databases that I'm going to use. So first of all, I've got a connection to my local SQL Server 2012 database here. And it's an AdventureWorks Lite database. If we have a look at the tables here, we can see the AdventureWorks tables. And what I'm going to do is synchronize a number of these tables up to the cloud to a SQL Azure database. So if we have a look here and query the customer table, we can see we've got all the customer records here. In the cloud, I've got a connection here to a SQL Azure server in a US-based data center. If I expand the databases here, we can see I have a couple of databases in the cloud, and for this first part of the demo, we're going to use Cloud US1. So this is a SQL Azure database, and we can see here, if I expand the tables, that again, I've got the same AdventureWorks Lite schema. So I've used exactly the same scripts to deploy my cloud-based database as I did my on-premises SQL Server 2012 database. But if I query the same table, the customer table, what we'll see is there isn't any data there yet. I've created the schema, created all the tables, indexes, and so on, but there isn't any data yet. I need to synchronize that from my on-premises SQL Server 2012 database. So let's use SQL Azure Data Sync to sync that on-premises database with SQL Azure. So for SQL Azure Data Sync, I'm first going to go into the Windows Azure portal. I've got the Data Sync node selected. And the key concept here for SQL Azure Data Sync is that of sync groups. A sync group defines 2 or more member databases that are kept in sync, and the data set from those databases that are kept in sync. So what I need to do is create a sync group containing that on-premises database and the cloud-based database. So I'm going to select this option here, which allows me to sync on-premises with the cloud. So the first thing I need to do is give my sync group a name. So we'll call it On-Prem with Cloud. And we can see here SQL Azure Data Sync taking me through like a wizard experience, guiding me through the process of creating a sync group. So next up, I need to create or specify the SQL Server database that I want to use. So I click in the UI here, and I've already registered the database, AWLT local 1, on my local SQL Server. I specify the sync direction, and I'll keep that as bidirectional at the moment, and select Finish. So that's my local database defined. Then I need to specify my SQL Azure database. So for this, I need the server name. So I'll copy that from here and specify the database name. Then my credentials. Test that connection, make sure I've got that OK, and click Add. So now I've defined for my sync group the databases that are going to synchronize. The next thing I need to do over here in the configuration section is specify the schedule. So on an ongoing basis, by default, SQL Azure Data Sync will synchronize the data every 30 minutes between these 2 databases. So I'll leave that as the default value. Then in the case of updates in multiple locations, I need to select the conflict resolution policy. In this case, I'll select the hub wins, the SQL Azure database wins. And then finally, I need to specify what data actually synchronizes. So we go into Edit Dataset. So we can see here in the list of tables, it's pulled the list of tables from the database. And what I'm going to do for the purposes of the demo is select a subset of these tables. So I'm going to select the address table, customer table, and customer address table. So we don't need to synchronize the whole database. When creating a sync group, you can specify a subset of the tables. You can also specify a subset of the columns, and then also specify row filters. So a subset of the rows are synchronized. But for the moment, I'll keep all columns selected for these tables, and I won't specify a row filter. So I select OK there. So now I've specified everything for my sync group. All I need to do is deploy those changes. So we have a look at the user interface here. We can see the first thing that Data Sync is doing is provisioning the databases. It's creating the appropriate change tracking tables in both databases and setting up the required metadata so that incremental changes could be synchronized between each of the databases. So it's done that provisioning, and now it's actually synchronizing that initial data set. So now the data is being synchronized. So let's go back to Management Studio and take a look at the cloud-based database. So this actually was our query on Cloud US 1. Previously, it returned no results. To execute that query again, we can see we've got that initial data set. Those records have been synchronized from SQL Server 2012 database up to the SQL Azure database in the cloud. So let's now make some changes. That's just the initial synchronization. So what I'm going to do here is we can see we've got a customer, Mr. Orlando here, a customer ID 1. So what I'm going to do is change his name. We'll change him to first name Miami. Update that row. And requery. So we can see we've changed the first name for this customer record. So let's go back to SQL Azure Data Sync. And rather than wait for the 30-minute interval to come around, what I can actually do with the sync group highlighted is say synchronize now. So there's no provisioning to do this time. It goes straight into the synchronization, and it's going to use the change tracking capabilities and see that only that record has changed and transfer just that record, just that row, from the SQL Azure database down to the SQL Server 2012 database. So that's now finished. Let's quickly hop back to Management Studio. And this is my query from my SQL Server 2012 database. Execute that. So we can see now the first name has changed. So here we've used SQL Azure Data Sync to set up an ongoing sync relationship between my on-premises SQL Server 2012 database and a SQL Azure database. We've done the initial synchronization. We specified the data that needs to be synchronized. We've done the initial synchronization and then made an incremental change and see that incremental change flow back from the cloud to my on-premises database. So the other main capability of SQL Azure Data Sync is to synchronize data between two or more SQL Azure databases. So the first scenario where this could be really useful is that for scale out. The ability to have multiple copies of the same data or a subset of a data set, have multiple copies, and therefore have multiple workloads using the multiple copies, therefore allowing an application or a set of applications to scale out. So for example, you could have a main web application with running an OLTP workload on one SQL Azure database, and then a reporting workload running that has a significant load, and you want to offload that onto another database. So you could use SQL Azure Data Sync to create one or more copies on which the reporting workload can run. And you could also actually create those separate databases, those copies, within different indexing strategies, for example, so they're more suited and more performant for that reporting workload. There's also the case where it's really advantageous if you've got a global user base to locate your applications and the associated data near the end users around the world. So you can utilize the various Windows Azure data centers to get those applications near to your end users and provide them the best experience, the most responsive experience on those applications by having those applications close to them and the associated data close to them. So when it comes to the application, you can use Windows Azure Traffic Manager to direct the users and the user requests to the nearest and most performant Windows Azure application instances. But then you can also use SQL Azure Data Sync to keep the various databases in sync. So the data is kept in sync between those multiple databases located around the world. So let's have a look at how we can use SQL Azure Data Sync to synchronize multiple SQL Azure databases. So I'm going to start again in Management Studio, like last time, and show you the databases we're going to use for this part of the demo. So previously we synchronized the local SQL Server 2012 database with Cloud US1, a SQL Azure database. We can also see here I've got a Cloud US2 database. So this is exactly the same state as Cloud US1 was. I've created the database schema, created the tables, but there's no data there yet. I also have a connection to a SQL Azure server based in a European data center. And there I've got Cloud EU1 database. So again, if I expand that out, we can see I've got the VentureWorks LT tables created, the tables, the indexes, and so on, but there's no data in those databases. So rather than have a look at the data in Management Studio, what we're going to do is use Data Sync in conjunction with reporting, and we'll have a look at the data using a SQL Azure Reporting report. So let's go to the Windows Azure portal. And so what we can see here, we've got the SQL Azure Data Sync section. We've got that highlighted. But I've also got a couple of other tabs. So if I jump to this tab here, we can see I've got a simple report for the AdventureWorks database. And I've got a label here which indicates the data source for this report, and that's Cloud US 2. So we can see we've got no data here currently. If I jump to the next tab, I've got exactly the same report. It's deployed to a European reporting server, and we can see that the data source is that European SQL Azure database. So again, no data there. So let's set up a sync group to synchronize these databases. So I'm going to go to sync groups and create a sync group, this time from the toolbar. We'll give the sync group a name. I'm going to specify my initial database, and this is going to be my Cloud US 1 database. This is the database, cloud database that now has a data set. Then I'm going to specify my other newer database, the new databases. The first one being US 2. And because we're going to use this for reporting, I only need the data flow to be in one direction. So I only need the data to flow from the hub, the Cloud US 1 database, to the other database. So I need to sync from the hub one way. So I can set that and add that database. And then lastly, I need to specify the database in the European data center. Enter that server. Enter the database. Specify my credentials. Test the connection. And again, set sync from the hub. So we're going to, again, synchronize from the Cloud US 1 database with the data to the EU1 database and add that. So then go over, finish the configuration. I'm going to leave the sync schedule enabled for every 30 minutes. I have to set the conflict resolution policy, although we shouldn't have conflicts in this situation if we're going one way. And then again, select the data set. So again, we can select the address, customer address tables. Hit OK there. So then finally deploy this new sync group. So just like last time, the first thing Data Sync service is going to do is provision those databases, get them ready for synchronization, create the change tracking tables and a couple of metadata tables that are required, and then perform that initial synchronization. So the databases are finishing provisioning and are starting to synchronize now. So synchronization is complete. Let's go back to the reports. So I can go back to, this is the AdventureWorks report on the US2 database, and click refresh. So here, again, I've used SQL Azure Reporting to create a report. I've deployed a report to the cloud. It operates on the US2 database. Refresh that report, and we should see the data appear. So we can see now that has. So the data now has now been synchronized from that US1 database to US2 and is now visible in the report. I should, the same, go over to the European-based report, hit refresh, and again, that's pulled, that now shows the graphs and the tables because the data is now available in Europe. So here now we've set up a sync group between two US databases and one European database, and the initial synchronization has occurred. So let's quickly go back to Management Studio and make a quick update and show that reflect in the report. So I'm going to do an interesting update here. I'm going to update the data so it shows up, it's very visible in the report. I'm going to effectively move all the customers that were based in the UK over to Canada. So I'm going to make that report to this is in the US1 database here. That's changed and impacted the 39 rows. Let's go back to the management portal. And again, just like last time, I can go sync now and invoke a sync immediately. So that SQL Azure Data Sync is now synchronizing these 3 cloud databases, will detect the changes made to Cloud US1 and propagate those to EU1 and US2. So that's now completed. If we quickly go back to the report, hit refresh. This is for the Cloud US2 copy. And we can see now the report now reflects those changes. And similarly, I can go to the report hosted over in the European Data Center. And again, the report's been updated. So here we've actually seen that one-way synchronization from that one SQL Azure database in the US Data Center to another database in the US Data Center and a database over in the European Data Center. And those changes being reflected in a report that are deployed using SQL Azure Reporting. So in this webcast, you've seen how SQL Azure Data Sync can be used to quickly and easily configure data synchronization. And we've seen the scenarios where data synchronization is required. In particular, you've seen how it allows data to be shared between SQL Server 2012 and SQL Azure, enabling your on-premises and cloud-based applications to work together. I hope you found this webcast useful. Thank you for watching.